So we're going on page 91 when we're done. We're going to start off with couple of super basic ones, and then we'll get into ones where we have to think a little bit more. So the first thing we're going to graph is 2 cosine of theta. Now the directions say on here to graph the function, then identify each characteristic. It's really way easier to do the characteristics and then graph it, because we can get all of this stuff from the equation, and then that helps us with our graph. So looking at this equation, what is our amplitude? 2. What is our frequency? 1, good, because that's b, which means the period is 2 pi, good. Do I have a vertical shift? No, so that's 0, which means my midline is y equals 0, okay? So then we're going to sketch our little parent function. This is cosine, so the parent function of cosine looks like this. Doesn't have to be beautiful. A lot of times mine aren't even really symmetric, but it's good enough to use for what I need to be used for. And then we're going to get our midline drawn in. It is at y equals 0, so right there. Okay, so here's how we use our little parent function. We always start here with the first point, whatever's on the y-axis, right? So on our parent function, that's at 0, 1. 0, remember our midline gives us a new x-axis. It's still on the x-axis, so we don't really need a new one. Instead of at 0, 1, my amplitude is 2, so I'm actually going to start at 0, 2. That's my first point. Okay. The next point you always do is the last point. And that point is going to be at the x value of whatever the period is. The period here happens to be 2 pi, so we go to 2 pi. And then since it's up here like this one, it's going to be right up here at 2. The next thing you do is go halfway in between. Halfway in between 0 and 2 pi is pi, and then that's going to be the amplitude below the midline. So at pi, I go down 2. So beginning, end, middle, and then I do this middle. Halfway between 0 and pi is pi halves, and that's at 0. And then halfway between pi and 2 pi is 3 pi halves, and that's also at 0. And that gives you your 5 anchor points. After that, it's just a pattern to fill in the left-hand side, right? I'm up here at 2 every 2 pi units. So this right here will be at this pi, then halfway on these, and this is your curve. Okay. We good on that? Again, just a super basic one, because it's really just the parent function that's been vertically stretched by 2. We good? All right, let's look at number 2. What's the amplitude in number 2? 1. Good, the amplitude's 1. What's the frequency? 1. So my period is 2 pi. Vertical shift of 4. So y equals 4. Okay. So this is another super basic one. All we're doing is shifting it up. This will get us to practice a sine one. There's my little parent function, which again, see, it's not even really like this piece looks a lot bigger than that one, but it's fine. It's good enough to get my points on there. So I have my midline is at y equals 4, so that's the first thing I'm going to graph. Just like if we had an asymptote, it would be the first thing that we graph. That midline is my new x-axis. So this point right here is at 0, 0. This is my new 0, 0. So that's where it goes. Okay. So that's the beginning. Then I go to the end. The end here is at the end of the period, which is at 2 pi. And it's also at a 0. Halfway in between is also a 0. Okay, so beginning, end, middle. And then the middle between these two, I go up, whatever the amplitude is, halfway between. So halfway between, I go up 1. Then halfway between these two, I go down 1 to get this last point. And I just keep track of what I've done over here so I don't get lost in where my points are. After that, it's a pattern. You have a 0 at every pi units, and then the up-down just alternates in between them. And your graph looks something like this. Remember, it's a curve. It shouldn't look zigzaggy. Some of them, you know, depending on where the points are, it's kind of hard not to make them super zigzaggy looking, but you got to do your best. If it just looks like you're connecting the dots, I ain't taking that mess. What questions do you have? Follow the pattern, follow the steps, do the same thing every time, and it will be a piece of cake. All right, let's look at number 3. What's my amplitude here? 5/2. My frequency is 2, good, which means the period is, so remember we always do 2 pi divided by the frequency, so I'm going to get pi. Vertical shift of -1, so my midline, y equals -1. This is sine, there's my little parent function. And then the first thing that I put in there is my vertical shift. I'm sorry, my midline. Well, it is a vertical shift, but draw in your midline. Okay. We are not I'm not talking to you. We're not shifting left and right now, so we'll always start on the y-axis. So this is starting at 0, 0, so I put this at my new 0, 0. Then I go to the end. The end of the period for this one is pi. So at pi, I also have a 0. So I've done the beginning and the end. Then I go to the middle, which is also a 0 right there. So then I'm going to go halfway between these two. I don't have a reflection, so I'm going to go up, whatever the amplitude is, from the midline. The amplitude is 5/2, so that's like 2.5. So halfway in between here, I'm going to go up 1, 2.5. And then halfway between these two, I go down from the midline. Always from the midline, not from the axis, okay? Because you have a new axis. You ignore the x-axis now. So between these two, I go down 1, 2.5. And there are your 5 anchor points, okay? Then we just repeat. So I have a 0 every other x value here. And then you just alternate going up and down. Something like that. Any questions? Alrighty then. Number 4, what's my amplitude? 5. What's the frequency? 1/2. Which means the period is what? 4 pi. Very good. Because remember, it is 2 pi divided by the frequency. So when I divide by 1/2, I multiply by 2/1. That's where 4 pi is coming from. Vertical shift of 0. So my midline is y equals 0. This is cosine. So this is what my parent function looks like basically. And my midline is at y equals 0. All right, everybody with me? Okay, so I start on the y-axis, and For my parent function, this is 1, but it's the amplitude of whatever my function is. So from here, I go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right here. Then the next thing I do is the end of the period, which would be at 4 pi. I can't actually do that, right? Because it's off my graph. So clearly can't graph that point. So then I go halfway between these two, which would be at 2 pi, and that would be down here. Can I plot that point? Yes, I can. So I'm going to go to 2 pi, and from the amplitude, or from the midline, I'm going to go down 5 to get this point. Then I go halfway between these two, which would end up at pi, and I have a 0. And it's not, I can tell by looking at my graph, it's not even worth bothering with that point because it's going to be off my graph also. So I can only plot 3 of the 5 anchor points, but that's okay. Is that enough for me to be able to do the left side of my graph? Yes, because I understand what the curve looks like, right? So it's going to come up and then come back down, which means I have a 0 here, and I'm at -5 here, and it's just a very stretched out, or horizontally stretched graph. What questions you got? Okie dokie. Let's look at 5. What's my amplitude? 2. My frequency is 8/3. What does that make the period? So we take 2 pi, we divide it by the frequency, which is the same as multiplying it by the reciprocal, right? So what? 3 pi 4. So this 2 is going to cancel that and get 4. So I'll get 3 pi 4. Yeah, 3 pi 4. Some of them you can probably do easily without writing them down. Some of them, like this one, even though it's not crazy hard, not a bad idea to write it down so you don't get the numbers mixed up in your head, right? And it's not going to hurt anything. All right, so I don't have a vertical shift, so that's 0, midline, y equals 0. Okie dokie. So this is cosine, looks like that. Oh, I forgot my midline. My midline is at y equals 0. Okay, so I'm going to start on the y-axis, up 2, since my amplitude is 2. So from my midline, I go up 2, I'm right here. Then I go to the end of the period. The end of the period is at 3 pi 4ths. Okay. Well, I know where pi is. The middle of that's pi halves. The middle of that's pi 4. So each one of these is pi 4. So that's 1, 2. This is 3 pi 4ths right here. That's the end of the period. Boom. What is halfway between 0 and 3 pi 4ths? 3 pi 8ths. 4th grade fractions, guys. 3 pi 8ths. Multiply by 1/2. Which, that's not something I really even have to actually find on here, but I need to be able to do the fraction. I'm going to go, this is where I'm down below the midline, so halfway in between, which is right here, I'm going to go down 2 from the midline. Then I have to go halfway between these two. What is this at? What's half of 3 pi 8ths? 3 pi 16ths. Super easy. Again, not something we can necessarily find on our graph, but we have to understand fractions. On the graph itself, instead of thinking about like this in terms of pies, from 0 to here, that's like one and a half spaces, right? So it's like 1.5 spaces. So if you have $1.50 in quarters and you give me half of it, how much do you have left? 75 cents, right? That's 3/4. So instead of this goes 1.5 away, I only want to go 3/4 of the way away to make my 0 right there. It's going to be right there close to that line. Which means coming from the other way, thinking this way, this is 1.5 spaces away. I want to only go halfway. I'm at 3/4 right there. There are my 5 anchor points. Then you just repeat to fill it in. Okay. I usually do something like all of something first. Like I would probably do all of my ups here because I can see that I am skipping 2 spaces every time, or 2 lines every time. And this is in the middle of them. And then go fill these in. So it's something like that. Good. Beginning, end, middle, 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 every time. I know this one takes longer to draw. Do we at least have all the points and part of it drawn? So you have an idea of what it is, then you can kind of just stop on that and let's move on. All right, let's look at number 6. What's the amplitude? 3/2. My frequency is 1. Oh, this is not the one I thought I was doing. Okay. The period is 2 pi. I have a vertical shift of 3, so my midline is y equals 3. This is sine, so it looks like this. I've got my midline up here. Start at my new 0, 0. Then you graph that one. Will you double check yourself with me? Make sure you're good. Any questions? Got this one? Okay. All right, so let's look at number 7. What is the amplitude on 7? 3. Frequency is 1/3, which means the period is 2 pi divided by 1/3, so it's multiplied by 3/1, 6 pi, good. Vertical shift of 1, midline is y equals 1. This is sine, so it looks like this. Midline is at 1. Okay, so I know I'm starting here. You get your next points on there. How many more anchor points can you plot? So if this is the beginning, this is the end at 6 pi, right? Clearly, way off my graph. The middle is at 3 pi, also off my graph. What's halfway between 0 and 3 pi? Y'all, this is not hard. Half of 3 pi is 3 pi over 2. That's all it is. 3 pi halves. 3 pi halves. Okay? So I can find 3 pi halves. That I can do. Here's 3 pi halves. From the midline, I would go up 1, 2, 3. And so clearly the other, like, there's no other points I can put on there, right? That's it. Is that enough for me to complete this and actually get a curve? The answer is yes, because you know what it looks like. You know it's supposed to come up and then go back down. And so when it comes up here, it's going to go down here, which means at negative 3 pi halves, I'm from the midline down 1, 2, 3. And then that's all I can do. And my graph looks like this. It's just very stretched out. And still get the curve in there. What questions you got? We good? All right, we're going to skip number 8 because there's a mistake in it anyway. We don't have to do every single one of these, but I do want to do number 9. So what is my amplitude? 4. Frequency is 2/3, which means the period is what? 3 pi. Good. Vertical shift of -1. Midline y equals -1. This is cosine, so my parent function looks like this. Here's my midline. Start on the y-axis, up from the midline. Remember, always go from the midline, whatever the amplitude is. So I start at the midline and go up 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, you get those other points on there. See how many other anchor points you can plot. Okay, let's talk through this together. The period is 3 pi. So this might do the beginning. The end would be at 3 pi. Totally off my graph, right? Halfway in between. What's halfway between 0 and 3 pi? 3 pi halves. See how easy that is? 3 pi halves. So I can figure out where 3 pi halves is. It's right here. So from the from the midline, I go down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, because that's the amplitude. So then halfway between 0 and 3 pi halves is what? 3 pi fourths. Here's 3 pi fourths, and it is a 0. Now look, I have this point, I skip 2 lines, I have a point, I skip 2 lines, I have a point, I skip 2 lines. I can get this one in right there. Got 4 of my 5. Then you just repeat it on the other side. It's just a reflection here. And it looks something like this. Okay. What questions you got? Beginning, end, middle, middle, middle. Every time. Draw the little parent function. Keep track of what you're doing. Okay? What questions you got? We good? All right.